Welcome to Security Spectrum, the nexus of global security insights and geopolitical analysis, brought to you by the experts at Riley Risk. Guided by myself, Will Swinton, a senior consultant for Riley Risk, and featuring insights from Riley Risk's very own geopolitical and security advisor team, as well as our special guests. On this platform, we delve into the complexities of international security, from the diverse challenges in Africa to the security dynamics of Europe, operational obstacles in the MENA region to the geopolitical events occurring in the Americas. Join us on Security Spectrum, where strategy meets the global chessboard, offering you unparalleled analysis on the pressing security issues shaping our world.
Good day to you all, and welcome to our first episode of Security Spectrum, brought to you by the team at Riley Risk, a team of internationally renowned global security analysts and risk advisors dedicated to explaining the complex and dynamic world of global security and geopolitical analysis. This first episode takes a deep dive into the current conflict in Ukraine, focusing on our forecast for 2024, from the tactical through the regional and onto the wider geopolitical impacts. I'm Will Swinton, the host for Security Spectrum, and I am based in Washington, D.C. as a senior advisor for Riley Risk, and I'll be moderating this first event. I'm delighted to be joined today by my co-hosts, Dr. Treston Wheat, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University here in Washington, and a security and geopolitical special advisor with Riley Risk team. And Dr. Marko Filijovic, a Riley Risk security and geopolitical advisor based in Brussels, and renowned for his expertise in international security dynamics and strategic assessment. So, this 40-minute episode will offer a comprehensive analysis of the Ukraine conflict, addressing real current concerns raised by representatives of the international NGO and international development community. This discussion aims to cover an update on current developments and challenges in the Ukraine conflict, our team's assessment and forecast for the conflict in 2024, and broader strategic implications and considerations for global security. Now, for your future reference, Riley Risk intends to stage these events on a quarterly basis, with our next event scheduled for mid-May. Prior to each event, we will be collecting polling questions and requests for insights from our attendees. This process will continue until the day of the event to ensure a comprehensive coverage of topics. This interactive approach is designed to cater specifically to the needs and interests of our audience. By design, these sessions are particularly beneficial for professionals in international security, geopolitical strategy, and those involved in humanitarian and development sectors affected by conflict. By engaging directly with our seasoned experts, attendees will gain a deeper understanding of the Ukraine conflict and its broader implications. Our purpose in these events is that participants can expect to leave with a deeper understanding of the complexities of our chosen areas of discussion, of the regional and global impacts, and strategic foresight into future developments. So, without further delay, let's move to our first item on the agenda, which is a review of the current tactical situation on the ground in Ukraine and what current significant implications this has for the freedom to operate for many of the international organizations presently in country. In recent months, the land campaign has ground on through a series of limited tactical actions up and down the front line in the Donbas region. Russian air and indirect fire and drone forces have increasingly targeted population centers and infrastructure, while Ukraine itself has successfully mounted its own deep strike drone operations well into Russian territory. Russia has persistently pursued its offensive strategy to capture the Donbas region, advancing on multiple fronts. The fighting in the northeast, where the Kharkiv and Luhansk regions intersect, has been particularly intense. So, Marko, as we come to the end of winter and the arrival of spring in Ukraine is in the air, How can you summarize the tactical activity over these last winter months? Have we seen any significant shift in momentum either way? Has there been any substantive territorial gain in these recent weeks? And what changes in strategy, tactics, and capabilities have we seen, if any?
Thank you for this question, Will. Well, following a summer counteroffensive, Ukraine made efforts to hold its position during the winter months, while the Russians significantly escalated their ground and air attacks in the first weeks and months after the new year. No significant territorial gains were observed on either side. However, it is worth noting that the Ukrainians successfully managed to cross the Dnieper River months ago, where they continued to resist constant Russian attacks. According to the latest report, they are also expanding their bridgehead along the east bank. We can also observe a significant focus on Ukrainian forces on Crimea, where they have managed to inflict noticeable damage to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Additionally, in the past few months, they have increased attacks in Russia's deep rear, with a particular emphasis on targeting the robust Russian energy infrastructure. However, their main focus in the coming months will be on building strong defense capabilities, which they have already started doing. In the report we published on January 31st, we highlighted the new approach of focusing on reconstitution and digging into defend against ongoing Russian attacks. This strategy will allow Ukraine to rotate forces, deploy its best units more effectively, and minimize the amount of ammunition required for defense. Additionally, further strengthening defenses, such as constructing underground bunkers and tunnels, could help counterbalance Russia's advantage in artillery and glide bombs. This would also contribute to the overall consolidation. Also, Kiev has started prioritizing the review of its policies on mobilization and recruitment as a part of its new strategy. This aims to address persistent challenges related to the structure, quality, and numbers of Ukraine's armed forces. Lastly, as Ukraine continues to collaborate with Western countries, it strives to scale up and reform its existing training programs in order to enhance the combat effectiveness of its forces. This involves expanding local training initiatives, revising Western programs, integrating training materials, and finding solutions to address the growing shortage of professional military education for officers and junior leaders. With the recent replacement of Zaluzhny with Syrskyi as the commander-in-chief, Kiev is also expecting to address persistent logistical issues and ensure a fair distribution of weapons provided by the West along the front line. As stated by Syrskyi himself, it is more important than ever to maintain combat tax performance, unit recovery, and intensified training. Additionally, placing emphasis on new technologies will also be one of the top priorities. In this regard, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has high expectation from the creation of the so-called drone forces, which will be an independent branch of the armed forces. Accordingly, Kiev has set the goal to produce 1 million drones this year, which seems reasonable given the proven effectiveness of this type of weapon in inflicting losses on the enemy. And just a couple of weeks ago, Kiev got the promise that it will get 1 million drones from NATO countries as well. However, it should be noted that both sides are increasingly relying on new technologies, particularly drones. They're constantly upgrading existing units and developing new ones. The difference is that in addition to drones, Russia is also heavily relying on shelling campaign. And it's expected that heavy shelling will continue given the high production rate and the arrival of stocks from North Korea, which gives Russia a comparative advantage in this regard, at least for 2024. Recent field reports indicate that Ukrainians are firing around 2,000 shells per day, while Russians are firing approximately 8 to 10,000. Additionally, it was also noticeable that the Russians, in their constant air attacks, began employing more frequent changes in their approach. This includes attacking from different directions, using variant trajectories, and employing different combination of means, which makes the task for Ukrainian air defenses more challenging. For example, as reported some 4 weeks ago, they tested the newest type of hypersonic Tsarkon missile on the battlefield, which features a different trajectory compared to the Kinjal or Onyx missiles they have been using up to now.
Very interesting, Marko. Thank you. That was really detailed, and I know that it's very much up to the minute stuff. But I wonder if I might ask you to continue and to follow on with any forecasts that you might have for the next phase of the ground campaign in the coming weeks as we come into spring.
Yes, well, on the Ukrainian side, considering the current focus on building strong defense capabilities, which appears to be the right move for Kiev, it is unlikely that a new counteroffensive will be expected until 2025. However, during 2024, what we can anticipate is an increase in attacks in the Russian deep rear, specifically targeting the energy sector, and on Crimea through various means of attack. For example, drones and especially drone boats have proven to be highly successful in this regard. We could have seen just a couple of days ago that the sea drone Magura 5 successfully hit another Russian ship. However, we can also anticipate the development and use of new innovative weaponry, such as drone swarms operated by artificial intelligence. Reports suggest that some of these, acquired from the UK, were already tested in the battlefield just a couple of weeks ago. On the other side, it is highly likely that Russia will maintain significant advantages in terms of material resources, industrial capabilities, manpower, and initiative throughout 2024. Taking this into consideration, it is possible that a ground campaign may occur in specific areas of the front, particularly in Kharkiv Oblast. However, the initiation and success of such a campaign would undoubtedly depend on assessing the strength of Ukrainian defenses and monitoring the overall developments related to the conflict. For instance, if the US support does not arrive in a timely fashion and artillery shells are not provided by the EU until the end of March, that might inspire Russia to launch a new massive wave of offensive sometime in 2024, taking advantage of the opportunity. Currently, with no large-scale offensive underway, Russian units have been assigned the task of carrying out smaller tactical attacks. These attacks aim to inflict steady losses on Ukraine and enable Russian forces to seize and maintain positions, but also consistent pressure on multiple points. The example of Avdiivka as one of those points has shown that this strategy is giving results, however, at a great cost.
Thank you, Marko. That was very, very clear. So then we've already discussed, and you've explained the introduction and development of some new emerging military capabilities on the battlefield. Treston, I wonder if I could come to you, sir. Can you update us on the latest reports on any substantive cyber activity in the conflict to date? Is there any evidence that cyber warfare has been playing a strategic role so far on either side? And how should cybersecurity considerations be handled by international organizations, third-party groups who are operating in Ukraine? And what impact does this have on their freedom to operate and communicate effectively?
Absolutely. So this is a really interesting historical event because it's the first cyber war that we're actually seeing live in action. So we're learning quite a bit about cyber operations and how it actually works in conflict. Now, the cyber aspects of the war haven't necessarily been strategically important. They've really acted more like auxiliary in support of either Ukraine or Russian activities, kinetic actions. Cyber has supported that, but hasn't been strategically important or decisive. But there are some really important things that we can glean from assessing this kind of cyber war. First, it very much helps Ukraine because there's a very low threshold of entry. So Ukraine was able to put together the IT army, as they called them, and do relatively low-level cyber attacks against Russia to help try and drain Russian resources and force them to focus on other stuff. And they have about 1,000 volunteers. And so these aren't even necessarily government people, but just Ukrainians supporting their country. And so you have this really low threshold of entry, which has been interesting to see as this kind of cyber militias develop. But as you mentioned in your question, one of the critical factors that we're focusing on is how cyber attacks have disrupted or targeted critical infrastructure. So right before the war, Viasat was actually targeted by Russia, an important communication system in Europe, and impacted the rest of the continent, not just Ukraine. And so this leads to sort of like a third part of this of understanding cyber attacks are not contained even within Ukraine. So to go to a couple of years before the war, we have the NotPetya attack, in which Ukraine was obviously the target, but spread and impacted major shipping companies like Maersk. And so as we're looking at this conflict and international organizations operating there, they need to understand that even if they're not direct targets, they're still going to be indirectly impacted by the kind of cyber operations going on. And sort of a final point of a major issue in this is this isn't the only first cyber war that we're seeing, but also the intervention of multinational tech companies. And this is what partially leads to the possibility of targeting by Russia outside of Ukraine. So Microsoft, Google, Meta have all entered into this space, either providing threat intelligence, taking down the infrastructure of GRUs, APTs, advanced persistent threat actors, or focusing on censorship of trying to limit Russian disinformation and propaganda that's like on YouTube and Facebook. And this is why Russia even declared Facebook was a terrorist organization, because these multinational tech companies are actively participating. Now, this matters to not just technology companies, but others, because being associated with them could make them targets as well. And so the really big issue that we're seeing for international parties or international organizations is that the cyber conflict can't necessarily be contained. It can disrupt critical infrastructure and can even make them targets in the West, even when they're not directly participating.
Fascinating, and more to follow, I suspect, on that score, Treston, as this conflict rumbles on. So let's take some stock here. If 2024 started with loss, pain, and anguish on the battlefield, coupled with mounting talk of Ukraine fatigue in many European capital cities, Marko, how would you characterize the domestic challenges that President Zelensky currently faces at home in 2024? It seems that independent polling has shown that national morale is at an all-time low point. And in some quarters, confidence in Zelensky's leadership is waning.
Yes, within the country, his popularity is declining, although more than 60% of people still believe in him, according to the most recent polls. Now, with the replacement of Zaluzhny, he might face even further decline, especially considering that the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army is the most popular figure in the country, with 88% of people expressing their belief. On the other hand, the new commander-in-chief, Syrskyi, lacks popularity, both within the army and among the civilian population. However, if he and the newly appointed team, all of whom are loyal to the president, make significant progress in the overall war efforts, this has the potential to turn things around. Morale is crucial in this context. Until September 2023, it remained high, but it has since started to decline. Currently, according to military personnel on the front line, the most significant issue is the critical shortage of infantry. In recent weeks, during interviews conducted on the front line, nearly a dozen soldiers and commanders repeated that their most pressing concern is the shortage of personnel, and mentioned that troops who are mentally and physically exhausted due to overwork sometimes cannot effectively defend their posts. As a result, their morale decreases and they become susceptible to illnesses and frostbite. For instance, one battalion commander stated that companies in his unit, on average, have only 35% of the required manpower. When asked about the number of new soldiers he had received, excluding those who had returned after recovering from injury, he mentioned that his battalion had only received 5 men over the last 5 months. Additionally, the nationwide evasion of military conscription in Ukraine also indicates a significant decline in morale. Many young people are resorting to illegal methods to avoid frontline combat, as discovered in August last year. We will see if the new strategy and the newly appointed military top will address these issues proactively, or will they contribute to a further decline in the president's popularity. It will mostly depend on the developments in the field.
Interesting. Thank you, Marko. Well, let's expand our strategic horizon here and chip across the pond. And it would seem that atmospherics in Washington, D.C. remain the most crucial indicator of sustained, meaningful overseas support for Ukraine's war effort. Now, we can address the big bear in the room, namely the US presidential election, shortly. But for the moment, Treston, can you please explain to our viewers, where does Congress currently sit with any existing aid packages? What is in the current pipeline? Where is it blocked? And how is it going to get moving again?
Excellent question. So to start, I think it's really important for people to understand that American support, funding in particular for Ukraine, is really happening within a domestic political context. It's not just occurring within foreign policy debates or international relations. And so that helps explain the problems of getting a bill passed. So the Senate passed a bill, $95 billion in January, and basically the House said, we're not going to do that. The Speaker of the House, Johnson, was like, we're not taking it. We're not passing it. So members of the House have tried to introduce new legislation that was significantly cheaper because it removed all the humanitarian aid, but it also added several border security issues, because that's what the Republicans really, really cared about. So they were willing to vote on this package as long as these border security issues were incorporated. but they still haven't brought it up for a vote because they're still debating what should be included and what shouldn't. So, for example, they're including support for Israel, but this is turning off left-wing Democrats who are opposed to Israel's actions in Gaza. And so they're having to negotiate multiple political contexts, domestic political issues to incorporate in the legislation. Now, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mike McCall, is leading the legislation, which is a good sign for the possibility of it being passed because he's chairman and will be able to bring it up to a vote. But if it goes to the floor, if Johnson brings it to the floor, there's going to be all kinds of domestic political issues getting it through. And his speakership might even be challenged because right-wing Republicans oppose support for Ukraine in certain contexts. And they may even say that's not enough border security issues that are included. So as we're looking at and assessing the likelihood of increased funding or funding for Ukraine, security professionals, people assessing this really have to keep in mind that this is occurring within American domestic politics, not so much foreign policy conversation.
Thank you, Treston. Very, very, very clearly explained. So if we trip back across the pond in the other direction, Marko, across Europe, it seems that recently we've seen a rash of political change in many of the European capital cities, changes which all seem to stir the pot of European consensus and a unity of effort. And we're currently seeing broader political readjustment across Europe. Much of it is directly linked to the shared burden of support for Ukraine over these last 2 years. So how do we see this playing out this year? The European Union has just pledged a further 50 billion euro of support, but is this now likely to be held up?
Good question. Well, on one hand, we observe that EU countries have agreed to allocate 50 billion in euros to Ukraine. On the other hand, there has been a wave of political change in several European capital cities. Certainly, the outcome of the elections in various EU states and EU Parliament, as well as the formation of new governments, will play a role in shaping the behavior of EU countries in the near and distant future. However, it should be fair to say that the formation of right-oriented governments won't go so smoothly as it might seem at the first glance. Also, depending on the formations of those governments, we will see how further activities will develop. For instance, let's examine Geert Wilders, who is often referred as the European Trump, and his right-wing Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. We know that he emerged victorious in the parliamentary elections. Known for his provocative language, Wilders and his party have consistently voted against providing aid to Ukraine. This stance raised concern regarding the future of both military support and the welfare of Ukrainian refugees. However, the House of Representatives in the Netherlands consists of 150 deputies representing 15 different parties following the recent elections. While the PVV emerged as the victor with 37 seats in the newly assembled second chamber, this is not enough to establish a majority. In order for Wilders to attain power, he will need to form a coalition with at least 76 MPs. This means he will have to negotiate with his direct competitors, despite having harshly criticized them during the campaign. Recently, Wilders openly stated that he proposed to unite with the third-place VVD party, the party of the current Prime Minister Rutte, and the newly formed center-right NSC party, which came in fourth. However, the leader of the VVD, Zegerius, has ruled out joining a potential coalition dominated by Wilders. Meanwhile, the NSC party has always been cautious due to political obstacles and disagreements over support for Ukraine. In addition, at the beginning of February, it decided to withdraw from the negotiations on forming a coalition with Wilders. The last official who led the talk, Ronald Plaster, resigned from the position 3 weeks ago, stating that the differences between the parties were too significant. On top of that, there has been an active discussion in the media about another option, which involves forming an anti-Wilders coalition to sideline him from the political arena. Therefore, forming this right-oriented populist government will not be an easy task. Besides, the Netherlands has recently announced its preparedness to offer up to 42 F-16 aircraft, and they unveiled a $2 billion military aid package in November for the procurement of ammunition, as well as the maintenance of equipment and weapons. Furthermore, Prime Minister Rutte has already made a promise to provide an additional 2 billion euros to support Ukraine in 2024. So it's highly unlikely that any government, including one with PVV membership, would go back on this commitment. What might happen is that the Netherlands starts delivering fewer weapons, but that won't happen in the short term. After all, the latest poll result in the Netherlands suggests that 58% of the respondents are willing to support Ukraine until its armed forces reach the border it had in 91. What will make more impact on the situation related to Ukraine is the outcome of the US elections and, of course, the ongoing development of the conflict itself.
Well, thank you, Marko, and thank you for setting up for Treston the next issue that we must address, the bear in the room. It is the common recurring question that sits at the core of all geopolitical forecasting for 2024, the question of the US elections. Treston, in as concise a form as you can possibly manage, how can you summarize your understanding of the current stakes that hang in the balance in relation to who wins this apparently two-horse race?
Absolutely. So now that we have the sort of presumptive nominees of Trump and Biden, we can really sort of dive into the policy differences, ideological differences that are most likely to come from this. So referring to like the legislation that we talked about a moment ago, President Trump or former President Trump could really sink that legislation by posting social media and coming out against it, because right-wing Republicans will turn against the legislation if Trump decides to go in that direction. Because we have very different competing foreign policy visions between Trump and Biden. Biden adheres to this sort of traditional liberal internationalism, multilateralism, and he has a touch of a Manichaean view of the world of authoritarians versus democracies. Trump, on the other hand, is very much a paleoconservative, neo-isolationist type. And he also tends to have an affinity for the quote unquote strong man. That's what we refer to in politics as authoritarian leaders or strong leaders. He has a relative affinity for that and is closer to the idea of working with Putin than Biden is. So depending on who wins the election is going to very much split U.S. foreign policy over the next 4 years. Either continue with the path of Biden and support for aid for Ukraine in the legislature, or Trump, who is most likely to oppose it. Because I think it's important to remember, one of his impeachments was actually about Ukraine, when he was trying to get information from the government about Biden's son, and led to a whole bunch of political issues. So you have the political part, but you also have the ideological part about what could happen. Now, sadly, most American voters don't actually care about foreign policy. There are very few national security voters. So again, as we're assessing this, we can say the U.S. election very much matters. America is still the global hegemon, and its funding and support for Ukraine is critical for Ukraine to defend itself. But that's not actually going to be the big political issue, even though it's going to be impacted. Unemployment, inflation, mortgage rates. These are the key economic indicators for who is likely to win. Now, that data is actually fairly mixed. And so this sort of comes off as hedging your bets, but I really see it as a 50% likelihood for sort of each candidate, because we have relatively low unemployment, but inflation is still a little bit too high. So interest rates are higher, which is impacting housing prices and car loans and all these things that people care about. But unemployment is down, wages are up. So the economic data is actually relatively mixed. We won't know until the end of Q2 really whether the data shows that Trump or Biden is more likely to win. But we do know we should go ahead and start assessing the foreign policy and security impacts of their relative decision making. And sort of final point on why this is really important is something we call the coattails effect. So the Congress is likely to shift depending on who wins the election. If Biden wins, it's likely to stay Democratic. If Trump wins, the House is very much likely to stay Republican. Biden is likely to bring Democrats back to the House, because there's only one person majority in the House right now. So it's very, very close. So whoever wins the election is likely to shift Congress in their direction as well, which will impact foreign aid.
Very interesting. Well, we don't seem to have that much longer to wait, but it will be certainly the background noise for the months ahead of us. So thank you, Treston. So all indicators seem to suggest that Russia does still harbor the strategic objective of bringing about the subjugation of Ukraine. Almost 2 years on since the latest full-scale invasion and the launch of their special military operation, Russia seems increasingly to believe that it is winning the war, And it may not now be a stretch of the geopolitical imagination that victory for Moscow is plausible with the full realization of their strategic objectives if Ukraine's international partners fail to properly resource the war effort. But if the West continues to provide sufficient ammunition and training support necessary to blunt Russian attacks forecasted for the coming spring and summer of this year, then Russia is unlikely to achieve significant tactical gains into 2025. If Russia lacks the prospect of gains in 2025, given its inability to improve force quality for offensive operations, then it follows that it will struggle to force Kyiv to capitulate by 2026. Beyond 2026, Russian combat power will have been materially written down, while their industrial base at home could be disrupted sufficiently by that point, making Russia's prospects decline over time. Adopting an approach that aims to ensure Ukraine's resistance through to the end of 2025 not only undermines the Kremlin's theory of victory, but also provides sufficient time to establish a rational mobilization and training process for Ukraine in order for it to qualitatively outmatch Russian forces, even if the latter continues to have the advantage of mass and scale. This is critical to building opportunities to continue to threaten Russia's position and thereby force Russia not to seek negotiations, but to actually negotiate an end to the war on terms favorable to Ukraine. So, Marko, what is the outlook for a sustained and meaningful level of unified support throughout Europe's capital cities, sufficient to sustain substantive support required through to 2026?
As one senior European diplomat stated the obvious, without Western support, it will be very challenging for Ukraine even to maintain its current position, let alone regain the initiative and make progress on the battlefield. Why? Well, the Ukrainian ambassador to the US, Oksana Makarova, recently informed the media that Ukraine is currently experiencing a critical shortage of military equipment, specifically missiles and interceptors. Moreover, Ukrainian military officials have repeatedly cautioned about the same in the last couple of months. And according to their latest statements, a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine has enough shells and ammunition to last until the end of March this year. So until the end of this month. Where is EU in all that? Well, first of all, recent polls indicate that a portion of the population in certain European countries is no longer enthusiastic about further supporting Ukraine. As we previously mentioned, right-wing populist politicians winning elections in several countries of Europe are not keen on continuing, or at least maintaining, the same level of support for Ukraine as their countries did at the start of the invasion. Furthermore, despite Germany and few others being highly committed to helping Kiev, EU countries barely managed to agree on allocating 50 million euros to Ukraine in the latest package. This is because when it comes to important things, we can see that EU is more a collection of countries rather than a strategic whole. When strategic considerations are at stake, local needs always take priority with those of the whole. So Hungary, Poland, Slovakia represent good examples. However, perhaps the most notable example is the EU promise to provide 1 million shells to Ukraine by March 2024, which did not happen. But in the meantime, the Czech president proposed a backup plan, which involved locating and acquiring 800,000 shells from third countries outside Europe for Kiev. And just yesterday, he announced that the necessary funds have been secured. The only issue, in his words, is the speed of delivery. However, even if the shells are delivered promptly, it may only buy time for Ukrainians. In other words, without military and financial support of the US, the EU alone will not be able to successfully sustain Ukraine. After all, that was openly confirmed by some high-ranking EU politicians themselves, expressing concerns about Europe's ability to replace the level of assistance that the US previously provided to Kiev. So bottom line, without US support, the EU alone will not be able to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Markos. So the war in Ukraine has already tested long-established international norms regarding territorial integrity and the sanctity of sovereignty and borders. It has strained severely relations between Russia and Western powers to breaking point, leading to sanctions and counter-sanctions that have broader implications for international diplomacy and cooperation. It has led to a humanitarian crisis, including mass internal displacement, untold loss of civilian life in the east of Ukraine, and severe economic hardship for much of the civilian population. The conflict has generated serious concerns about energy security, further complicated by the reliance of some European nations on Russian natural gas. And all of the while, the ever-present threat of expanding the conflict to a wider war with NATO remains a profoundly unimaginable, yet increasingly real scenario. So, Treston, from a great power politics standpoint, what geopolitical scenarios are most likely to play out in this coming year?
Very good question. So we're seeing the war in Ukraine have reverberating effects across the world, from food security to semiconductors to even the reconfiguration of the balance of power in Europe, i.e., more countries joining NATO and increasing the collective security organization. So the most likely scenarios that we see is Russia continuing the conflict, sort of draining its power, but trying to push its interests elsewhere in the immediate vicinity, particularly Africa and the Middle East, which is going to distract them as well. So Russia wants to take its sort of last gasp at being able to push its national interest and its security, Putin's ideological understanding of Russia's security in the region. But from a great power politics perspective, this is going to shift the global balance of power, because even though America is the only global hegemon, we're seeing Russia and China continuing to compete as great powers. And so as Russia is declining, one scenario that is very, very likely is, as we see Russia sort of declining, getting bogged down in Ukraine, trying to push itself in Africa in particular, China is going to push against it as well. We saw this during the Cold War between the Soviets and the CCP. That kind of scenario is likely to repeat itself. China might push its territorial interests as Russia can't really defend itself because it's so focused on Ukraine. China is competing in Africa for minerals and resources. And the Wagner Group, the reorganized Wagner Group, is there as well. And so this may not just be a competition between the US and Russia, the West and Russia, but also China as partner, but also kind of enemy to Russia as well. So from a great power politics perspective, we're going to see this ever expanding chessboard. And you mentioned a couple of issues that are going to be critical to this. Energy security is very, very important. The US, OPEC, very much cares about the price of oil and what this means. And this relates to the earlier part of the conversation about economics, because higher interest rates strengthens the dollar. And that happened partially because of the supply chain issues out of Ukraine, because Ukraine was the primary supplier of neon gas, for example, which is a critical component of developing semiconductors. And so all of this becomes intertangled and intertwined, especially from a great power politics perspective, where the US, China, EU, NATO as an organization are having to compete on multiple levels. So it's basically 3-level chess that's an ever expanding board, where one move in Ukraine or in Africa impacts the other ones as well.
Well, thank you, Treston. And to you also, Marko, because on that note, that brings to a close the first of these presentations brought to you by Riley Risk. I do hope that you have all enjoyed this format and found its content and the dialogue that you've been listening to by our learned panelists to be insightful and thought-provoking. If you are interested in hearing more from the team at Riley Risk on a broader range of global topics, please visit our website for more information, or look out for notifications advertising future events on LinkedIn. Thank you and goodbye.
As we conclude another insightful episode of Security Spectrum, we thank you for tuning in. Join us again at Security Spectrum, where we leverage our comprehensive risk advisory expertise. Together, we navigate the nuances of global security, offering clarity and strategic solutions in an uncertain world. We encourage you to subscribe and stay connected for upcoming episodes.